All right, let's get started. I've got a few people on our class that are calling in that I don't see on the roster, but I don't see any of those people on this. Let's see who else is there. Yeah, the ones I have, there's someone that's coming across as CHEKE. Not sure who that is. And someone's come across as Juan Sanchez, but there's no Juan Sanchez's in the class. Someone's coming across as Ashley Higginbotham. Are you on this call? That name's not anywhere. I got D. Ross, and then someone's coming across as Monkey, Monkey. If any of you are using that account, let me know. So I'm trying my best to do the roll off of what Zoom gives me. All right, let's get started. So tonight we want to do this problem. So let's get into it. So I'm on page 14 of the class notes. We're just going to work a problem. So the way I'm going to do this, we're just going to work a problem. To see it works, the math is not that difficult. I'll introduce you a little bit to swaps, so that'll be important that you have some exposure to swaps. And then as we're going, take notes. You might, I wish I would be on video. I'd love to see people. I would recommend you actually get a calculator out and do it with the calculator. You can definitely do it in Excel, but you won't have Excel on the exam. So at least at some point, sit down and do it with the calculator. But again, it's pretty simple math. You don't get formula sheets for the exam, so you just have to know these formulas. They're easy formulas. So we'll work through it. I'll go back to the notes that we skipped from last time up above that talks about what you need to do in response. And then, I don't know if we'll work another problem, but I also want to go through, this looks really straightforward. It looks like it just works perfectly. It's just like this magical thing. But then I'll talk about some of the practical issues with this because it's not quite as perfect as it makes it show in this example. So I got this, I think, on part 2 of the CFA exam. Part 2 of the CFA exam could have been part 3. Part 2 and 3, they tend to do a lot of derivatives on that part, and this is definitely a derivatives problem. I know Warren Buffett says he doesn't like derivatives. He talks about them being really risky and all that, but here's an example where derivatives are very inexpensive, fast, cheap, just easy way to eliminate a huge risk. So let's start with this problem. Everybody got page 14? We're going to start this problem. We have a bank here. This bank has cash. The duration of cash, almost by definition, is 0. Cash is not sensitive to interest rates. The price of cash is not sensitive to interest rates. And this bank also has some loans. $850 million in loan, and they have a duration of 5.2. 5.2 is a very long duration for bank loans. Now you might think, well, auto loans are 5-6 years. I've even heard of 7-year auto loans, but you have to remember auto loans are amortizing loans. You're paying principal and interest. So the duration is going to be at least half of the maturity. So if you have a 6-year auto loan, its duration will only be about 3 years. So 5.2 is pretty long. You may be thinking about mortgages. Banks tend not to hold mortgages on their books. They tend to sell them off. So this isn't a pretty extreme bank, but just to give you a good practice with it. So very long duration of loans. They've got $1 billion in assets, and then they have debt. This could be not debt. It could be deposits, like certificates of deposit, savings accounts. We're going to talk about checking and savings accounts because that's the big uncertainty in this analysis. And I'll tell you what we discovered when I did this in practice that makes a big deal. But here we're using debt. Debt's very simple. It's very easy to calculate the duration of debt because it's the exact same thing as the duration of a bond. It's just the other side. So their debt has a duration of 3.75 years and they have net worth of 250. So the question is, what is the duration of their net worth? Remember, duration tells us how sensitive something is to interest rates. So the longer the duration, the more sensitivity. We're going to talk later about dollar duration gap analysis, where your goal is to actually get the duration net worth exactly to zero. So we'll talk about that. Banks don't do that, but pension plans do. All right. So we got the data here. So let's just do the formulas. So the first thing you do is you got to calculate the duration of assets. Duration is one of those things that's really quite simple. The duration of assets, of bonds, you just take the duration of each piece, take the weighted average, add that up. It gives you the duration of portfolio, just like beta. Remember the beta of a portfolio? It's just the weighted average betas of all the stocks in your portfolios. So the duration of a bond portfolio is just a weighted average duration. There's no offset going on here that something strange is going on. It just really just does add up. So here, if you remember the problem, we had 150 in cash, 850 in loans with a 5.2. So 15% has a duration of 0, or 150 over a billion. 85% has a duration of 5.2. So the duration of their assets is 4.42 years. So what is the duration of their net worth? So here's the formula. You just have to know this formula, but again, it's a very simple formula. You take the duration of assets minus the dollar in liabilities divided by the dollar in assets times the duration of liabilities. You take the leverage of that. Leverage is nothing more than assets divided by net worth. So let's look through the numbers and you tell me a number you don't see. So the duration net worth, 4.42, y'all see that? That's the duration of assets. Minus 750, 750 is how much they had in liabilities. Divided by a billion, that's their total assets. Times 375, 3.75, that's the duration of their debt. And you take all of that and you leverage it up, a billion over 250, and we get a duration of net worth of 6.43. And I say years. I had a big debate with a peer who said duration is not in years, but if it's not in years, I don't know what it is. Years makes the most sense. So questions on that? Hopefully you read ahead of the notes and you already have worked this and you feel comfortable with it. Not really, really difficult. So how do we get a duration of net worth of 0? Well, to get duration net worth of 0, you got to make this inside part equal to 0. And one thing you'll notice, you don't get the duration of net worth 0 by having the duration of assets equal the duration of liabilities. That doesn't work because there's more assets than there are liabilities. So for the duration of the net worth to be 0, your duration of liabilities would have to be longer than your duration of assets because you have more assets than liabilities. All right, so we'll see that. So you don't get the duration net worth to 0 by just moving the duration of assets down to 375 or something. All right, any questions on that? Any thumbs up? Everybody get it? I mean, everybody's, no one's on video. So, okay. Maybe I should pay y'all $10 each to go on video. You know, we're going to be in class next week, so you can't hide your face next week. So you're all beautiful people, so you should want to be on video. I'm the old guy here with all the wrinkles. Y'all should want to be on video. All right, let's go to this next one. Well, this one is, I'm just asking you a question. All right, some students get really, really confused about this third question and the fourth question. So put in your notes, this third question has absolutely nothing to do with the fourth question. Some students try to equate them as if it's a continuation or something, but they're not. One is just to make sure you know a formula. The other one is just to make sure you can convert a formula into something else, but they're different things. So what would you think the net worth of this firm would do if interest rates were to fall 150 basis points? Remember basis points, you take the 150 divided by 10,000. 150 basis points is 1.5% or 0.015. You have to know this formula, not just for this class, you got to know this formula for life. Every finance major, every actual science major knows this formula. It's one of those basic formulas, kind of like the capital asset pricing model. Everybody just knows it. So the percentage change in net worth equals minus duration times the change in yields. So we got minus, and duration net worth was 6.43. Notice I put the plus sign there. I'm always real clear. Is duration positive or negative? And did rates rise or fall? So we got minus positive 6.43 times negative 1.015. So if interest rates were to fall 150 basis points, this firm's net worth would actually go up 9.6%. Now, how can we check that? Well, what would the assets have done? So the duration of assets is 4.42. So minus 4.42 times 0.05. That would give you assets going up 6.6% or jumping from 1 billion up to $1.066 billion. On the liability side, you take minus the duration liabilities times minus 1.05. So liabilities would rise from 750 up to 792. You take the new assets minus the new liabilities, and you get 274. 274 is 9.645% higher than the 250 they started with. Now, what do banks want to happen right now? Do you think bank net worth, duration net worth is a positive number or negative number? If you're a bank CEO, would you want a positive net worth so that you lose money if rates rise, but make money if rates fall? Or right now, would you want to be a bank CEO who has a negative duration net worth? You make money if rates rise and you lose money if they fall. Anybody have a preference here?
We want the negative. So when rates rise, it goes up.
Right. So negative duration, and most banks do have negative duration and net worth. I remember at USAA, it was pretty obvious when rates fall and fall and fall. For a while, it was wonderful for USAA because they had a floor on their credit card. So when rates fell, the contract on the credit card said, we cannot go below this rate. So as rates fell, they hit that floor, and boy, they were making a lot of money. But they're also losing a lot of customers. Because people were like, why am I paying 10% when I can pay 8%? So they had to get rid of that. And so when they got rid of that, as rates fell, what they were making on their credit cards fell, what they're making on their auto loans kept falling. But then what they were paying on their CDs and certificates, deposits, and savings accounts, as you got close to zero, the lowest they could go was zero. So the liability side hits zero and can't go any lower, but the asset side keeps coming down. And that's what banks are experiencing right now. The asset side just keeps coming down. The liability side's hit right at zero, can't go any lower. And so right now, banks would actually like for rates to rise. So most banks probably have a duration of net worth that's negative. All right. Any questions on this question here? You can practice it. We got plenty of problems I'm going to give you. I'll give you more problems to practice with. You have plenty to practice. All right. So this is a pretty common thing you see. I looked at some of your banks and they don't have this in particular, but they have something similar to this. This is called a stress test, right? Y'all are definitely seeing stress tests in your bank's write-up. Every bank does stress tests. Someone's not on mute, so please mute. So this is the stress test. The stress test just says, hey, what if this happened? What would happen? What if interest rates were to fall 300 basis points? What would happen? What if interest rates were to rise 200 basis points? This is exactly what we did at USAA. What would happen if interest rates we did plus and minus 300 basis points? The board says if we have an extreme event where rates fall 300 basis points or rise 300 basis points, you're not allowed to be exposed to greater than a 15% loss in your net worth. If interest rates were to fall 200 or rise 200 basis points, the most you can lose is 10%. And if interest rates were to rise or fall 100 basis points, the most you can lose is 5%. But here, if you run our 6.43, so you do minus 6.43 times 0.03, if rates fall, we make a positive 19%, but if rates rise 300 basis points, we'd lose 19%. We're actually violating the policy. We're violating the policy here. violating the policy here. Now, one question I asked on the exam is, what is the implied maximum duration of net worth in this board policy? Can any of y'all figure that out? I mean, it's in the answer there, but can you figure it out and you see how I figured it out? They're saying if rates rise 100 basis points, we can't lose more than 5%. If rates fall 100 basis points, we can't lose more than 5%. What would the duration of net worth have to be so that you lost 5%? Any takers? So there it is right there, 5 years, right? If the duration of the net worth is 5 years, positive 5 years, and interest rates rose 100 basis points, what would their net worth do? It would fall 5%. If the duration of net worth was 6 years, 100 basis points would cause their net worth to fall 6%. They'd be out of violation. All right. Hopefully y'all all see that. A lot of students struggle with that, but the board itself implies all you got to do is look at the 100, look at the hundreds. Whatever the hundreds is, that's the reduction. Now, one thing you have to put in the answer, I just count off a little bit. You have to do plus or minus. It is plus or minus. So the board's saying the highest the duration net worth can be is 5 years. The lowest the duration net worth can be is negative 5 years. All right. I can't tell if y'all know that because no one's on, hardly anybody's on video. Does that make sense? Juan Carlos, that makes sense? Edgar, makes sense to Edgar. Luke, you got it? Yes, Kelly's got it. All right. We'll see on the exam because that's one question of probably about a fourth to a third of the class misses. And they're like, how do I get that out of here? I just go right to the 100. If it's 5%, then it's 5 years. If it's 6%, then it's 6 years. And then don't forget the plus or minus. All right. They can't have a duration of negative 7 years. That would be great if rates rose, but that'd be terrible if rates fell. All right. All right, so we're going to talk about what they need to do. We're going to come back to that. All right, I'm actually going to do that at the very, very end. But they've got a problem, don't they? The duration of net worth is 6.43 years. And yet the board says, hey, you can be positive 5 or less. You can be negative 5 or more, but you can't be 6. You can't be negative 6, negative 7. And you're 6.43. You're violating policy. You've got to immunize your balance sheet. You've got to fix this, all right? So we'll come back to this discussion here. So how do you fix this? All right. So we define interest rate risk. It's the risk that you lose net worth because interest rates change. We've measured it. Our measurement is duration of net worth. How are we going to mitigate it? We're going to mitigate it using balance sheet immunization, using swaps, interest rate swaps. All right. If this is your first time you use an interest rate swap, be ready. It's magic. It's really incredible thing. Before we do that, I just want to show you what a swap is. I did my first swap. Told my boss, I really want to do swaps. These things are wonderful. I'm going to show you some actual numbers that we did. We did it with our pension plan. But I told my boss I want to do interest rate swaps. And he said, fine. He brought me the accounting standards for derivatives. It was 2 books about 3 inches thick, each one of them. And he said, read this. Fortunately, I didn't need to read it because we had a really good accountant that knew all of that. So I just went to him. And then I got the contract. And this is a swaps contract. It comes out for the ISDA. ISDA is the International Swaps and Derivatives Association. You might go to their website and see what they have. I don't know what these words are. I think, maybe there's some German words in there, maybe. But I get this contract. I've never seen a swap contract in my life, and I got to negotiate this contract. And just show you a couple of sentences they have in there. It says, if the aggregate amount that would otherwise have been payable by one party exceeds the aggregate amount that would otherwise have been payable by the other party, replaced by an obligation upon the party by whom the larger aggregate amount would have been payable to pay to the other party the excess of the larger aggregate amount over the smaller aggregate amount. I read that like 5,000 times. It's like, what are they saying? I mean, I'll tell you what I was most concerned about, but I was like, I'm not exactly sure what they mean. I mean, this is the standardized contract. So this is the simplified standardized contract. This isn't the wild, crazy one that they had before. This is the standardized one. And so I say, okay, that's kind of crazy. And then I came to, there's plenty of them in here, but I came to another one. So this paragraph here, and this one was really, really important to me. And I'll tell you why this was so important to me. So I had to understand this part of the contract is probably the most important part of the entire contract. And I'll just read it to you. It said, if, however, automatic early termination is specified in the schedule as applying to a party, then an early termination date in respect of all outstanding transactions will occur immediately upon the occurrence with respect to such party of an event of default specified in these sections, or to the extent analogous thereto, and as of the time immediately preceding the institution of the relevant proceeding or the presentation of the relevant petition upon the occurrence with respect to such party of an event of default specified in these sections, are to the extent analogous thereto. I was lost on the first analogous thereto. I've never used analogous thereto in a paper in my entire life. I'm like, hey, this is really, the automatic early termination is like extremely important to me. I didn't understand it. My lawyer had never done a swap contract before, but he said, we have a firm that is, they're experts in swaps. I said, great, let's bring them in. Let's pay them money because I got to get this right. This is my very first swap. I showed him these and other paragraphs, and the two lawyer experts on swaps said, we have no clue what that means. So I said, okay, great. I'm glad you're experts. So what I had to do, and these are lengthy contracts that go on quite a ways. What I had to do, and I just told the lawyers, I said, this is what I need. You tell me that what I need is in this contract. And what I want, and this is really, really important, we're going to talk about the risk of swaps, the credit risk. I told them that if I want out of this swap, I want to get out in one phone call and get all my money back overnight. Because if the party I'm dealing with is having financial difficulty, I want my money back in a second. I don't want to wait 3 weeks. I don't want to wait 5 days. I don't want to have some court proceeding going on. If I say terminate this contract, they will terminate it immediately and give me all my money. All right, y'all can see why that would be important, right? I did this before 2008. So obviously, 2008, the entities we were dealing with, this was a big deal. These are complicated contracts. The problem is, this is the contract, but swaps also have an annex. An annex is another bunch of pages with equally complicated language that I also had to read, that the lawyers didn't understand either. I'm actually convinced there's not a lawyer out there actually understands any of this. They all just know what it says, but none of them can actually find it in the language. So it's kind of one of these trust things. And so I told my lawyer, they better know what they're talking about, because if I'm not understanding this right, we're talking billions of dollars here. I want to make sure we understand this. This is pretty important. So if you're dealing with swaps, it's complex. It can take some time. It took us a few months to get our first swap contract set up. And the reason it's so complicated is this contract and the annex, we had to sign it. The counterparty had to sign it. And our custodial bank had to sign it. So we had 3 parties having to sign this thing. I also had a swap dealer who had been in on it. And so if we made any minor change, it had to go to the lawyers of all those entities. And it was like this circus of, we're down to just one word change, and that lawyer's out on vacation for a month. And it was so irritating. I actually lied on the phone call at one point. I told him, if I don't get this contract today, I'm calling my CEO, and he's going to call your CEO. I don't think I could have gotten that to be done, but I was so mad, and that worked. We got the contract that day. It's tough. It's really retarded. I'm going to talk about some risk management that you can do with these type of contracts. One thing, get into your notes and know about this. This is actually a great thing to talk about in an interview. Swaps are wonderful things, but they're over the counter. They involve hefty contracts. If you call a swap dealer, they will say, hey, we can get this done in a few days. They're lying. They can't. These things take a very long time. You need to get these contracts set up well before you need them. Don't think, hey, I'll do a swap when I need it and I'll get the contract done then. It will not work. I remember Barclays Bank came to us and I told them how frustrated I was with these contracts and said, oh, we're fast. Well, you'll be shocked at how fast we are. 9 months later, my lawyer called me and says, I don't want to deal with Barclays ever again the rest of my life. They're horrible. We couldn't get it done. We gave up. It was just too frustrating. So be aware, these are wonderful things to set up, but do it now. Get it approved, get it set up, get this paperwork out of the way because markets can move really fast. And if you think, oh, I got some time to do it, you may not have time to do it. You might be pretty shocked at how long it takes to keep these contracts set up. All right, so that's a swap. So how does a swap work? So let's just work through it. The only way I know how to go through a swap is just to do one. All right. So let's say we have two entities there. We have a firm called AAA and we have a firm called BBB. It just so happens that the firm name is also their credit rating. It's just pure coincidence. So AAA can borrow money fixed rate. If they want to go out and borrow money at 5 years, they can borrow at treasuries plus 125. If they want to borrow floating rate, they can borrow LIBOR. Have y'all heard of LIBOR before? The London Interbank Offer Rate. It's actually going away, and I don't know what it's being replaced with. It's quite the undertaking. There are trillions and trillions of dollars priced off of LIBOR, and LIBOR is disappearing because of the crisis in 2008. But I'm sticking with LIBOR just because I don't know what else to use. So that's what AAA would pay. This is just normal. There's no swap here. If AAA wanted to borrow money for 5 years, yeah, Eric, I haven't looked at the math there yet. If you use something other than LIBOR, then they have to make some adjustment because there's too many contracts based off of LIBOR, and LIBOR and this replacement are not the exact same number. You can't just substitute in a new number. So yeah, I haven't been in this business in a while, and I'm not really sure how they're handling it. It's got to be a mess. So AAA is treasuries plus 125. If they borrow fixed rate, if they borrow floating, it's LIBOR plus 10. BBB, if they borrow fixed rate, they borrow treasuries plus 185. They borrow floating rate, they borrow LIBOR plus 20. All right, no swap here at all. However, the first thing you do when you get the problem is you write this column here, the difference. All right, this will not be on the exam, so you have to write this difference. What we're trying to figure out is where does AAA have the comparative advantage and where does BBB have the comparative advantage? Now, AAA has the absolute advantage in both because of the higher credit quality, but they do not have a comparative advantage in both. So if you don't like the term comparative advantage, we use that term when you talk about trade, which country should produce which products. It's that kind of concept. One country might produce baseball bats and gloves cheaper than another country, but it's how much relative cheaper. If they can do bats a whole lot cheaper than gloves, then they should do the bats and the other country should do gloves. That's the comparative advantage. It works the same way here. So AAA is 60 basis points cheaper on fixed rate, but they're only 10 basis points cheaper on floating rate. And that's the way you expect it because there is a term structure of credit spreads. What that means is the further out you go in maturity, the higher rate spreads rise for lower credit quality versus higher credit quality. And so that's what you would expect. All right, so wherever this number, and if you don't understand comparative advantage, just memorize this. Wherever this number is larger, that's where AAA has the advantage. Wherever this number is lower, that's where BBB has the advantage. So AAA has the comparative advantage on fixed rate. BBB has the comparative advantage on floating rate. All right. Now, why is that important? Because of the way we set up the swap. Okay, that's all explained in here. All right, y'all stop me if you have questions. I'm going to move through. So the only purpose for question one is to figure out who has the comparative advantage in fixed and who has the comparative advantage in floating. I will not give you a question where where that difference is exactly the same. And it usually won't be because of the term structure of credit spreads. All right, here comes the swap. calculate the ultimate borrowing cost for AAA and for BBB if these two entities borrow in the debt market in which they have comparative advantage. There's no swap yet, they're just borrowing money. And then enter into a fixed for floating interest rate swap where AAA pays LIBOR to BBB and BBB pays Treasuries plus 140 to AAA. All right, now that's not what they're going to actually do. There's actually going to be a third party in between them. And that's the way I actually have it set up. And I'll show you that. There's actually a swap dealer in between. So AAA really doesn't know BBB exists. BBB doesn't know AAA exists. They're just dealing with the swap dealer. All right, so let's look at this. I got this all set up. If you want to take a picture of this so you have it before the video, that'd be fine. It's all set up. So let's just look at this. So first we start right here. Nothing strange here. AAA had a comparative advantage in fixed, so they just go out and they borrow fixed at T plus 125. So Treasuries are at 4%. They're going to borrow at 5.25% for 5 years fixed. That will never change. All right, everybody see that? Nothing unusual there. BBB is just going to go out and borrow floating at LIBOR plus 20. This will change. Every time LIBOR changes, what they pay in interest will go up and down. If LIBOR rises, they'll pay more in interest. If LIBOR falls, they'll pay less. All right, so AAA is fixed at Treasury, whatever the current Treasury rate is. It doesn't change as Treasury rates change. Whatever the Treasury yield is today, that plus 125 is what they're going to pay for 5 years. BBB is going to pay whatever LIBOR is and changes over time plus 20 basis points. Here's the swap dealer. The swap dealer sets up the swap so that BBB is going to pay Treasuries plus 140. And the swap dealer is going to pass that through to AAA. AAA is going to pay LIBOR, and that's going to be swapped over to BBB. Now, what does the swap dealer get out of that? I'm leaving that part out, but they're going to get a few basis points off of this. All right. So just whatever their take is, who knows? That's kind of that bid ask. Do y'all know that there's actually a swaps curve? Have y'all heard of that before? You might look that up. Interest rate swaps curve. It's just like the Treasury curve. So these are not rates that people are negotiating. The swap dealer is not saying, well, this is BBB, I better charge them more. There's an actual swaps curve that you can look up and you know what the rates are. The Federal Reserve used to show the swaps curve, but they don't show it anymore. So it's an interesting curve. I'm actually going to show you what happened to the swaps curve in 2008, some pretty amazing things. All right, so you might Google, I don't know what happens if you Google interest rate swaps curve. You could probably get the swaps curve. I'm going to try it, see what comes up. I see one that says how to create in Excel. That's interesting. MATLAB. I just don't see the actual curve. But if you go into the Bloomberg machine will have the swaps curve. You can look it up and they give you all the numbers. The swaps curve is usually slightly above the Treasury curve. Now, why aren't swaps more dangerous? The reason they're not more dangerous is that they have a lot of collateral behind it. BBB has a set of collateral. AAA has a set of collateral. There's money sitting there just in case something goes wrong. That's why they're so low risk. In fact, there was a point in time where the swaps curve actually fell below the Treasury curve, which is pretty amazing. All right. So one thing to be clear here, and we're going to have to talk about this thing of a notional amount. I don't know how to get this in your notes. It's the hardest part of it. Let's say AAA borrows $300 million. So AAA borrows $300 million. They get $300 million in cash, and they're going to pay T plus 125 on that fixed for 5 years. BBB borrows $300 million. They get $300 million, and then they're going to pay interest at LIBOR plus 20. That's going to change over time. On the swaps, all they pay is the interest. So that $300 million never gets exchanged on the swap. But that $300 million, and you'll see it in the notes, is the notional amount of the swap. It's the dollar amount you need to come up with so that you can apply that interest rate to something. So while the $300 million never switches through the swap dealer, these rates, this LIBOR and this T plus 140 is going to be applied against the $300 million. This T plus 140 will be set at the very beginning of the swap and will never change. This LIBOR is going to change every time LIBOR changes. All right, questions up to there. Forget everything below and that midpoint in the graphic. Sounds like everybody's okay, but I can't see very many of y'all. See a bunch of names. All right. So what does this mean for AAA? Well, AAA's ultimate borrowing cost, which is what the question's asking, they went out and they borrowed T plus 125. You notice what I have here. If they're paying, I put a plus sign. If they're receiving, I put a minus sign because it reduces their cost of debt. So they pay T, they pay 125, they receive T, and they receive 140 from BBB. And then they pay LIBOR to BBB. So the T's cancel out. So you end up with LIBOR minus 15. Anybody remember what did they pay in the problem? Wasn't it LIBOR plus 10? They could have gone out and borrowed floating. That's what they want to do. They want to borrow floating. But if they just went out and borrowed floating, they would have paid LIBOR plus 10. Instead, they entered the swap, and now they're paying LIBOR minus 15. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? It's like magic. It must be that BBB must be playing a whole lot more, right? AAA must be ripping BBB off. So let's see what BBB gets. So BBB goes out and borrows LIBOR plus 20. They receive LIBOR from AAA, and they pay AAA treasuries plus 140. The L's cancel out. You end up with T plus 160. What was BBB borrowing out? It's treasuries plus 185. BBB wants to borrow fixed, but if they borrow floating, they borrow fixed, it's going to cost them T plus 185. But if they borrow floating and enter the swap, they can borrow fixed at just T plus 160. Wow, that's magic. How did two people end up with better rates? And let me show you the magic here, all right? Some of y'all probably already figured it out, but we'll get into it. So AAA ended up at LIBOR minus 25. They saved 25. BBB ended up with treasuries plus 160. They saved 25. Anybody figured out where that 25 came from? It's on that page right there.
It's the difference between 60 and 10, and then it's 50 and then split in half. I do have a question on that. Is it, for like test purposes, is it always going to be 50-50?
That's the way I do it. And I think I've even heard another professor who teaches swaps and says that's the way it works. I don't know in practice if that's the way it's worked. It's the way I set up my problem just because it makes it easier for me to set it up. I'm not necessarily sure because remember in practice, AAA and BBB don't even know each other. Right? So we're talking about the swaps curve. I'm not 100% of that. The swaps curve doesn't know what BBB is paying. The swap curve doesn't know what AAA is paying. And the swap curve is a swap curve. So Blake, I don't think that, but I know another professor said so, but I don't know how to actually go out and prove that one way or the other. But yeah, if y'all heard what Blake said, you can actually figure out this problem before you even start working it. The difference between 60 and 10 is 50, and I take that 50 and I just split it between the two firms. So 25 goes to AAA, 25 goes to BBB. So instead of paying LIBOR plus 10, they end up paying LIBOR minus 15. Instead of paying treasuries plus 185, they pay treasuries 160. So what have we done? We've essentially split the term structure of credit spreads, right? Y'all can see how this would not work without the term structure of credit spreads. If they were the same, we wouldn't have anything to split. So because spreads get wider as you go forward, and the term structure of credit spreads is very reliable. It's not like the treasury yield curve. You know, sometimes the yield curve is usually normally sloping. Sometimes it's steep. Sometimes it's flat. Sometimes it's negative. The term structure of spreads should never be negative. triple B bonds should have to pay a whole lot more for 10-year debt relative to AAA than floating rate. That's because that's just a risk, right? You loan a triple B company money for 10 years, that's a lot riskier than loaning a AAA company for 10 years. So that term structure as credit spreads should always be there, should always be very reliable. And essentially, you have the swap is working is these two companies are taking advantage of that term structure of credit spreads, and they're just splitting it between themselves in some way, whether it's 50-50 or some other way. I mean, I could have set up this problem so that wasn't the case, right? I could have just changed the swap so that wouldn't have been the case. All right, so this is a good time for questions. If anyone has questions here.
I'm having trouble understanding why you added the 25 to the LIBOR rate for AAA, but then you added the 25 to the top part of the triple B, I believe.
Well, I reduced both of their costs by 25 basis points. But that only works if they borrow in the market where they have the comparative advantage. So it almost means lower quality firms, they're going to borrow floating because they're almost always going to have a comparative advantage on floating. And high quality firms going to borrow fixed. So let's say you have a high quality firm that really wants to borrow floating. They will come out ahead if they borrow fixed and swap to floating. And Gazelle's asking if you can just calculate that difference and plug it in. I will actually see you do this math, and then you can use what I just said as your check digit. All right. Now, if AAA wants to borrow fixed, then they're done. They just borrow fixed, right? They borrow fixed at T plus 125. They don't need to do a swap. The swap wouldn't work in their case. So if the high quality firm wants to borrow long term, then they might as well just borrow long term. They're already have an advantage in that market. So yeah, the T140 I give you on the exam, Corey. So y'all can see what comes on the question. The T plus 140 and the L on the swap, I give you the swap. So you have that information. All you have to do is know how to plug it in. All right, so this is how swap works. Both entities come out ahead just because of the term structure of credit spreads. They save significant amount of money. I don't know what the term structure is right now. You can look at the swap curve and see what that structure is. Or you could just go out to a credit analysis, and just see what AAAs are paying 10 years and what triple Bs are paying 10 years and get that difference and compare it to the 1 year or the 3 month. So it's not that hard to find these numbers. I don't know if I use real life numbers here, but in fact, AAA is probably a little bit high. T plus 125 seems awfully high. All right, we're going to do another problem, so we'll get more practice on it. But the ultimate borrowing cost, we just did that. And Corey, to your question, this is everything. You're given this entire amount of information, and you got to produce what I just did there on the PowerPoint. Now to someone asked, Kelly asked, what does it mean for something to go wrong? So what could go wrong on a swap? So some people call this interest rate swap arbitrage. Arbitrage means, it's just too good to be true. Both entities come out ahead. But it's not truly arbitrage. Arbitrage means you have some gain without any risk. You're getting some kind of risky return without taking any risk, but it is not arbitrage. And why is that? Well, let's look back at the PowerPoint. Now, here's where it's important to know that the swap dealer is sitting there in between. So triple B doesn't really care if AAA goes insolvent. AAA doesn't really triple B goes insolvent. They're just worried about the swap dealer. As long as the swap dealer is not insolvent, they're in good shape. But let's say, let's look at the AAA side. So let's say AAA is paying 1% and receiving 5%. And that's really a massive amount of money. Maybe in the present value terms, that's worth $300 million, and swaps do have a market value. So maybe that swap is now worth $300 million or $400 million or whatever, 50 million, who knows what. Well, if the swap dealer goes insolvent, AAA loses all of that. they're out of luck. And they can't go after triple B because they don't have a contract with triple B. They only have a contract with the swap dealer. And so it just really is an arbitrage. What's happening is AAA is trying to manage their interest rate risk. And to manage their interest rate risk, they really want to borrow floating. But they're better off borrowing fixed and swapping the floating. So they've reduced their interest rate risk by doing this, and they did it at a really good rate, but they're picking up credit risk with this swap dealer. But it's a really interesting swap credit risk because sometimes the swap dealer owes them money, and sometimes they owe the swap dealer money. Some of y'all write this down. You'll notice, you'll see this when you talk about your banks. Well, actually, I'm not sure because we're not doing credit risk, but most swap dealers and most companies that do swaps, they have what we call a net master agreement. And what that means is all the contracts they have with this swap dealer, they net them all together. So if you have 10 contracts with this swap dealer, you're going to net them all into one number. So sometimes you might owe them money, sometimes they may owe you money. When you look at the actual credit risk, they net them all together. So you only have one number. And the reason they do that is, let's say the swap dealer goes insolvent and its creditors come in and they go to AAA and they say, hey, AAA, we've got these 3 swaps where you owe us money. And AAA says, yeah, I owe you money on 3 swaps, but you owe me money on 7 swaps. And the creditor says, we don't care about that. We can't pay you. We're bankrupt, but you owe us money on 3. So give us the money you owe us on the 3. If you have that master netting agreement, that means that the creditors have to net it all together and they can't go after certain contracts and not on others. So it's an important component to this. So credit risk is a big part of swaps. Now, who are swap dealers? I'll give you a name of a swap dealer you may have heard of. Anybody ever heard of them? Anybody worry about credit risk with Lehman? We didn't have a swap with Lehman in 2008, but they were a dealer. What about Bear Stearns? I don't know how to spell them anymore. I haven't seen it in a while. Have y'all heard of these companies? Bear Stearns didn't necessarily go insolvent. They were bought out, fortunately. What about Morgan Stanley? Y'all heard of them? So Lehman's the one that went insolvent. If you had a swap deal with Lehman in 2008 and they owed you money, you would have had collateral. Remember this collateral, so you would have gotten your collateral back. But markets were crazy. You might have had $100 million collateral on Friday, and everything blew up over the weekend, and Lehman's out of business on Monday. And because of the way interest rates were so volatile, they might have owed you $300 million on Monday, but you only have $100 million of collateral. And in that case, you're going to lose that $200 million. So it's regular credit risk. Yeah, Juan Carlos, I'm not understanding your question. You may have to rephrase it. Don't get confused on the T plus 125. On both borrowing here and on the swap, that's all set on day one. That T never changes. They will always pay that. So that might be 5%. So Triple B is going to just pay 5% to AAA the entire 5 years. AAA is going to pay LIBOR. So every time LIBOR changes, AAA has a new amount that they've got to do. So right now, if you entered a swap because the yield curve is upward sloping, Triple B would be paying AAA money. And AAA would just be netting that because, you know, T plus 140 is probably, what, about 3.2%. LIBOR is probably 0.1%. But with the Fed raising rates, there's a good chance 6 months or so from now that LIBOR could be much, much higher and AAA may actually start paying Triple B. I don't know if that answers your question, Juan. I couldn't quite. It's kind of hard for me to do chat and so it's a lot of things. I'm not quite as coordinated as y'all think I am. All right. Takes a while to sink in, but we're going to do multiple of these problems, so you'll get more practice. So it's not arbitrage. What it's called is counterparty risk. Counterparty risk is a special type of credit risk. And it's special in the sense that if I were to loan IBM money and they owe me money, I would always have credit risk to them because they always owe me money. But if I do a swap, sometimes I owe them money, sometimes they owe me money. It's a little different because the swap can change. If interest rates change, if I'm paying LIBOR and they're paying fixed, I'm probably receiving money. But if LIBOR shoots up, then I suddenly have to owe them money. And so when you see counterparty risk, what that means is it's related to a derivatives transaction where sometimes one party owes the other, sometimes the other party owes the other. It kind of switches back and forth. So it's not this constant credit risk. If I loan IBM $100 million, I've got a $100 million credit risk to them. And that doesn't really change other than the interest that they owe me. So it's really $100 million. But on a swap, how much I'm at risk changes every single day as interest rates change. And it's the risk that when they owe you, they go bankrupt. If you owe them and they go bankrupt, it's like you're going to still have to pay it because their creditor is going to make you pay it. But it's not as big a, you're not that worried that, you owe someone money that's out of business. You'll make your payments like you always did and you're fine. You'll probably get out of the swap and pay them whatever the market value of that is. All right, we'll get into the counterparty risk more, and that's a really important concept. All right. I'm going to go back to the first part of the problem. We're going to add the kind of the end part to this. So how do we put all this together? So let's go back to the previous question. Remember, we had this bank whose duration of net worth was 6.43 years, and that's too long. 5 is the max it could be. So what did they need to do? They need to reduce the duration of their assets or increase the duration of liabilities. One of those two things. How do you reduce the duration of your assets? Well, maybe you go to your sales force and say, hey, stop doing those 5-year loans. Do more short-term credit card loans. That would do it, right? 5-year loan has like a 3-year duration. Credit card loans essentially have a 0 duration. That would work. Stop doing home equity loans and only do really short-term auto loans. That would do it. The problem is, do you really want your sales force selling products based on the duration of the bank's net worth? That seems like a really crazy reason to make decisions. What do you want the sales force doing? You want them to sell what's selling. If people are buying cars, you want them giving auto loans. If people are buying houses like right now, then you want them doing mortgage loans. If retailers are taking off, you want them doing credit card. You don't want the sales force to say, hey, oh, you want to borrow money for a car? Would you rather have a credit card instead? That doesn't make sense. You're disrupting your operation. So that's kind of crazy. How do you increase the duration of liabilities? Well, you could go to your sales force and say, you know what, you've been selling these 1-year CDs, certificates of deposit, push to 5 years. I mean, they're not really good rates, but push them anyway. Our duration of net worth is too long. We need to increase the duration of our liabilities. Again, that's going to disrupt operations. That's a crazy thing to do. You could switch from short-term debt to longer-term debt, but remember the problem we just did. Certain entities have competitive advantages in long term, some have competitive advantages in short term. If you need to switch from short term to long term, but short term is where you have that advantage because you're not so highly rated, maybe you're triple B. You say, man, I don't want to do this longer term debt because the interest rates are much higher because our credit quality is not that good. That's not a good solution either. They need to borrow money where they have the advantage. So the last thing they can do is use the derivatives, forwards and futures interest rate swaps. And this they can do by moving from floating to fixed. All right, we're going to go and look at the problem. Let's look at it now. Which of these entities started with floating rate debt, but ended up with fixed rate debt? AAA or triple B?
Triple B.
Triple B, exactly. Yeah, they started with floating, they ended up with fixed. What did they do? They increased the duration of their liabilities because they went from short-term debt to long-term debt. So triple B, if they were the bank with a 6.43 duration of net worth, and it was triple B should enter the swap and swap from floating to fixed. If, however, the 6.43 was AAA, what should AAA do? They shouldn't enter the swap, should they? That would reduce the duration liabilities. What should AAA do? Any guesses there? But they have the comparative advantage in fixed. What should they do? So you should just pay off some of the short-term debt and borrow more long-term fixed debt. They don't need to swap at all, right? They just need to, hey, we got too much short-term debt. Let's get rid of some of that short-term debt. Let's borrow longer term. That fixes their problem, all right? So with that 6.43 duration net worth, triple B is the only one that makes sense in that scenario to do the swap. Triple A would not make sense in that scenario. If you're still struggling, don't worry, we're going to do a few more of these. All right, so in this particular problem, refer back to the previous question, determine which side of the swap transaction the company should take in order to reduce its interest rate risk, and it should be triple B side. This is the yellow is the answer. Triple B, because they started with floating and ended up in fixed, thus increasing the duration of liabilities and thus reducing the duration of net worth. All right, let me write this incorrectly because I do count off for this on the exam. I have students that type this. Anybody see a problem with that? They started floating rate, ending with fixed rate, thus increasing their liabilities and thus reducing their net worth. Is that what they did? You know, any bank out there that says, hey, we're working hard to reduce our net worth. Doesn't make sense, right? So what? And I have students say, boy, professor, you're so picky. Try saying that in an interview and see how they look at you. Yeah, we learned how to use interest rate swap to reduce the duration, reduce the net worth of banks. They're going to look at you like, what school did you go to? Oh, I had Professor Sweet. It's like, no, don't say that. Say you went to A&M or something, right? So there's a problem with that. So why am I so picky? I'm so picky because it's absolutely wrong. This bank did not reduce their net worth. What did they reduce? They reduced the duration of their net worth. Very different thing. They didn't increase their liabilities. They increased the duration of their liabilities, all right? So I'm very picky on the language. So be really, really careful. A lot of students do that though. Hey, this bank needs to reduce their net worth. No, they don't. No bank wants to reduce their net worth unless they're paying dividends or buying back stock, but you don't want to lose net worth because of some risk that happens to you. So you're reducing the duration of net worth and thus reducing the risk of the bank, its exposure to changes in interest rates. All right, so we just worked an entire problem. We're going to work another one so you can get some practice. But let's do a quick, let's go back to the very, very first part I skipped before and see if this now makes a little bit more sense now. I am going to do dollar duration gap quickly here. So in the table above, we can see that the bank's board permits a duration of net worth of no more than 5 years and no less than -5 years. You can determine this by looking at the allowed change in net worth at 100 basis points. Given the formula, percentage change in price or net worth or whatever is minus duration times the change in rates. If duration of net worth is -6 years, when it needs to be between -5 and +5, what does the bank do? Here, the duration net worth is too low. It's -6 when it needs to be between -5 and +5. In that case, they need to increase the duration of net worth. Exact opposite of what we did when the bank's duration net worth was positive 6.43. They need to decrease the duration of liabilities or to do an interest rate swap. In this case, they would have been on AAA side. They would want to have started and fixed and ended up in floating. Of all of those solutions, which one makes the most sense? Should they change what products they're selling? It doesn't make sense. Should they change what markets they're borrowing money in? Doesn't really make sense. The interest rate swap is like this beautiful, wonderful, simple solution. And I mean really simple. The first swap I did, it was a 10-minute conversation. We got $3 billion put on. And it would have been a 1-minute conversation, but the swap dealer says, I think I can get a better rate. Let's wait just a few minutes. So I'm just waiting on him to execute. I'm like, go, go, go. 5-year treasury. I was waiting for rates to get as high as possible. And the 5-year treasury hit 525. I'm like, and y'all probably never heard of a 5-year treasury at 525, but when I did the swap, the 5-year treasury is 525. I'm like, execute. I love that rate. Let's do it. Let's go for it. And he said, no, I think I can get another basis point. He says, oh, you're going to kill me here. But he finally executed at a really good spot. All right. So that's what swaps do. Now you can do this exact same thing with futures. So as you're reading what your bank does, remember on your bank, you're going to talk about define, measure, mitigate. Interest rate swaps, futures, forwards, that's part of the mitigation of price risk and interest rate risk. So if you see your bank does futures, does interest rate swaps, they're mitigating a risk by using those securities. They probably both use futures and swaps. I don't like futures. I don't like the math behind them. Swaps to me make a lot more sense. They're a lot easier, but you probably should understand how to do both of them. Swaps are over the counter. And by over the counter, what that means is you're dealing a sophisticated buyer and seller. And because it's not an organized exchange, it means you're picking up that counterparty risk. Now, swaps don't just have to be interest rate swaps. There's a bunch of them out there. You can have equity swaps where you pay LIBOR and they pay you whatever the S&P 500 did. You can have currency swaps where you pay the dollar and they pay you the pound. You can have weather swaps where they pay you how much rain you got versus how much temperature. There's swaps. There's all kinds. I've seen even inflation swaps. They're not quite as powerful as others because there's just not much volume. There's a lot you can do with swaps. Now you probably all have heard of credit default swaps. I've never done a credit default swap. It's hard in my mind to think of a credit default swap as a swap. It seems more to me like a swaption than a swap, but people assure me it works just like any other swap, but I find it a little strange. If any of y'all are taking John Tui's class, he might go into credit default swaps, and that'd be an interesting conversation to have. All we're caring about here is interest rate swaps in this part of the class because we're managing interest rate risk. And now I said it only takes a 10-minute phone call. That's after you spend the 3 months with the lawyers, right? But once you spend the 3 months with the lawyers, it's very simple phone call. Now, what do you do on the phone call? So let me show you that. All right, this might be the last thing we can do tonight, and we'll do an entire other problem on Thursday, and you can let it kind of sink in. So let's do this very last thing here. We're going to do dollar duration gap analysis. Now, I'm just going to tell you, banks don't usually use that term. This is really for pension plans, but you could use the term. So dollar duration gap analysis, what it's doing is telling you what swap to enter in order to get the duration of net worth to exactly zero. All right. Here's how it works. You take the duration of assets, 4.42, times the dollar amount of assets, $1 billion, minus the duration of liabilities, 3.75, times the dollar value of liabilities, 750. That gives you the dollar duration gap, 1,607.50. And then you call your broker, and your broker says, hey, I got a really good 5-year duration swap out there. You say, okay, 5-year duration, you take 1,607.50, divide by 5, and that's how much of a swap you want to do. That's the notional amount of your swap. So if you had a 10-year duration swap, you would get a notional amount of 160.75. But you have a 5-year swap, you take the dollar duration gap divided by that, So when I call my swap dealer, before I call him, I calculate the dollar duration gap on my pension plan. And I think it was like, let's say it's $3 billion or $6 billion. And he tells me, okay, I got a swap has a duration of 10 years. On the phone call, I just take my dollar duration gap analysis, divide by 10, and I tell him, yeah, I want that swap and I want my notional amount to be whatever it is. If it's $3 billion divided by 10 years, I want a $300 million notional value swap. And if I do that, the duration of my net worth will go to exactly zero. I'm not going to prove that here. We don't have time. If you actually plug in the numbers, you'll see that it works. I'll show you all that next class because I don't want to get that in here because sometimes it takes me longer than I think it's going to take. So that's dollar duration gap analysis. Banks don't usually do that. Most banks have a duration of net worth, positive or negative. That's somewhat part of their process. Most banks don't shoot for exactly zero, but pension plans oftentimes do want to have exactly zero. They don't want any exposure to interest rates at all. And we'll see why later, because pension plans are extremely sensitive to interest rates. And so they're like, you know what, just take it to zero. Why are we taking this risk? All right, that's dollar duration gap analysis. All right, so let's summarize this up. If your duration of net worth is too low, too negative, you either need to increase the duration of assets or decrease the duration of liabilities. For the swap, we're assuming we're on the liability side, so you want to decrease the duration of liability, so you want to swap from fixed to floating. That's what AAA did above. If your duration is net worth is too high, that's that 6.43 we just did. You either want to decrease the duration of assets or increase the duration of liabilities. We're assuming we're on the liability side, so in that case, we want to decrease the duration of liabilities, so we want to swap from floating, increase duration of liabilities. So we want to swap from floating to fixed. That's where triple B is. Now, why am I saying I want to assume I'm on the liability side? And I'm not trying to mess with your minds. Banks think about swaps on the liability side. They're trying to increase and decrease the duration of liabilities. Pension plans are on the asset side. They're trying to increase and decrease the duration of their assets. I don't know why. That's just the way it is. You get the exact same answer whether you're thinking on the asset or liability side. You're going to buy the exact same swap, but you're going to think about it in a different way. So, and I'm going to show you a pension plan and you'll actually see how that works. All right, so it's extremely important you understand this. You might not right now because we've only done one problem. What I strongly recommend that you do is before next class, work the example problem. So there's an example problem on page 17. Try working it without looking at the notes. If you can't do that, then try working it with the notes. I do have the answer in there, but practice that problem and go through the entire thing, all the way down to the dollar duration gap. All right, try the whole thing. And next class, I may try to show you how the dollar duration gap actually gets you to exactly zero. And so we'll see that math. I don't think I have it in the notes, but maybe I'll type it into the notes so you can take a picture of it. All right, we've got a few minutes here. So any questions up to here? Someone's got to be lost. Probably half the classes. This is kind of tough your first time through. Is anyone like, wow, I have no idea what he just talked about? Is that why y'all are all, no one's on video?
Hey, Professor Sweet. I think I could help clarify a little bit if you'd like me to. I learned about this in international finance.
Okay.
If you could scroll up to where it shows the comparable rates for AAA and triple B.
Okay.
Okay. So in international finance, we learned about a quality spread differential, and that was just if you took or subtracted each of the rates, so each of the comparable rates, so Treasury plus 125 minus Treasury plus 185 minus LIBOR plus 10 minus LIBOR plus 20. And it would give you a basis point calculation. You wouldn't do it. I'm just you wouldn't do it that exact way. I'm just saying it as an example. You would get a basis point quality spread differential. And then through that, you could either, or I guess the entities could decide to share the benefit of the basis points. So split those exactly in half. Usually the swap bank would demand a few basis points, maybe like 10 or 15. And then I guess the majority of the basis points would go to a firm that has a higher credit rating.
Yeah, you think that. So I can tell you, when I did this, I never talked to Triple B. There was no Triple B. And I don't want to talk to Triple B because I might need $300 million and they may need $200 million. So it's much easier for me just to go to Morgan Stanley and say, hey, I need $300 million. They may have to go out and find 5 people to get that, or they may actually hedge their risk using the futures market. But my phone calls were all just to the broker. So I don't know, in your international finance, if they talked about, and there you may be talking about 2 entities that are actually doing a contract, you know, because they have currency exposure, they're selling to each other. So in the current, and y'all know I don't like currencies at all. So in the currency world, there might actually, Fernando, be a closer relationship between the entities, because then they know exactly what the notional is because they're trading with each other. So that could be possible. But on the interest rate side with banks, all I know is my counterparty. I pick up the phone and talk to my counterparty. However they hedge their book of business, that's up to them. And how much they split it between the 2 parties. I'm splitting it 50-50, but how they split it, you know, a lot of that's going to be based on what the swaps curve is more than anything else. I mean, it's just going to be the swaps curve. So I don't know how the currency curve works, but the swaps curve is a swaps curve. I don't even know if there is a currency curve, but the swaps curve is the swap curve. And that is what rate you're going to get. There's not really a negotiation of, well, triple A, I'll give you this, triple B, I'll give you this. It is a curve. You go out and look at it, and that's the rate you're going to get. And that's why my swap dealer could send me a Bloomberg screen that would tell me exactly what the market value of my swap was, because he knew exactly what rate I could get out of it, because there's always a swaps curve. So, I mean, that's interesting, Fernando. I should probably take international finance because y'all know I'm so bad at currencies. I just have a mental block on them. But I could see currency swaps would probably be quite a bit different. I also have not done equity swaps, and I'm not exactly sure how equity swaps work in this context and how they decide. So y'all can see I love interest rate swaps. I can't say on other swaps exactly how this stuff is working because I just have not done those. All right, so Hector's asking about the dollar duration. The dollar duration comes at the very, very end and just says, I just tell you to use it. It's usually, the dollar duration gap is a problem that probably 90% of the class gets 100% on. So you're gonna see as you do it a couple of times, but just know dollar duration gap analysis is simply saying, I want the duration of my net worth to be exactly 0. What swap should I enter? And that depends on what your dollar duration gap is and what the duration of the swap is. And you divide those out, and it tells you exactly what notional amount you need. All right, so I'm gonna stop it there. Yeah, I gotta practice to give you some encouragement. This problem is usually, most students do really well on this problem. And this class, I think, is smarter than all previous classes. I can just tell, although I can't see your faces, so maybe not. We'll see. But so you're going to do well on it. You just need some practice. So get used to it. It's an incredibly powerful thing to know because it's real life. This is what goes on. I've done these contracts, and it's I mean, in one phone call, you can manage billions of dollars of risk. It's just incredible. And they're very flexible. They're very liquid. So, you know, this is part of finance where I think we've done a good job. Finance has done a good job of actually managing risk by creating these things. I think sometimes we create hand grenades that just blow up on us, but here's a case where we've done actually a pretty good job. All right, I'll stay around for a couple of minutes, but not too much because I have another class. All right, let's start. So what I want to do, last class, we worked through this problem pretty quickly. I want to work through it again, but more slowly, give you a chance to really sink in. We'll talk about some of the issues with doing this because it's not quite as perfect as what we just showed here. There are definitely some contingencies and caveats to this. But let's look at this bank. This one's unusual. This is the more unusual one, although it's maybe not too unusual even today. Let's say we have a bank with $1.1 billion in assets
No mames.
and
Eso es qué.
cash 200, loans is 900. And so, that's more normal. A duration of 3.3, that might be, well, that's still probably a little bit long for bank loans. We'll talk a little bit more about that. You notice, probably the most uncertain thing down here is the cash. What is the duration of cash? And there's a big debate on that. So we'll talk a little bit about that because it's not quite as easy as it looks here. And then their debt, they have 3.9 duration of debt. There's a net worth. So when we calculate, can y'all tell who's not muted? I can't see everybody.
I think he just
Right.
muted.
All right, thanks. Yeah, that's the frustrating part of Zoom. All right, so the duration of net worth, very simple formula. The first thing you have to do is figure out the duration of assets. So you can notice here, I simplified it. You can take 200 divided by 1.1 times 0 plus 900 divided by 1.1 times 3.3. But since this is 0, you can just take 9 over 1100 times 3.3. And so you get a duration of assets of 2.7. So the duration of net worth, remember this formula. So 2.7 minus 950 over 1100 times 3.9 times 1100 over 150. So here they actually have a duration of net worth of negative 4.91. My guess is most banks have a duration of net worth probably in the negative 1 to 2 range, more than likely. Probably not negative 5, given that we may be going in a recession and the Fed could actually have to cut rates, but most banks are probably set up for rates rising. And most banks do prefer, when rates are really low, they do prefer rates to rise, as we talked last time, because of the way their savings accounts work. And that's why the duration of the savings account is so uncertain right now. So calculate the firm's expected net worth if interest rates were to rise 200 basis points. Remember, this problem has nothing to do with the question I asked you about the bank's, the board's requirements, but I don't have that problem in here. But so this formula here, you should know the percentage change in net worth equals minus duration times the change in yield. And you notice I'm real picky on the signs. So minus duration's minus 4.91 times the change in yields, 200 basis points is 2%, but they're rising. So if interest rates were to rise 200 basis points, this bank's net worth would actually increase 9.82%. Notice that I'm asking for the dollars, so make sure you convert that into dollars. Take their beginning net worth of 150 times 1 plus that change, and you get 164.7. Now, this bank would be in compliance with what the last bank had, because they had a 5-year plus or minus 5, and this bank's duration net worth is only 4.91, even though it's negative. But let's assume they want to immunize. So all immunize means is move the duration net worth closer to 0. So if they want to do that, what would they want to do? You need to raise the duration of net worth by decreasing the duration of liabilities or increasing the duration of assets. But here on the swap, banks, again, I don't know the history of this, banks think of swaps as changing the duration of liabilities. Pensions think of swaps as changing the duration of assets. We'll see pensions next week. I'm going to show you some examples of that. All right, everybody see that? So let's talk the issue here. So when we did this at UTSA, we had 2 scenarios. And the reason we had 2 scenarios is the deposits and some of the assets. And in particular, some of the deposits. Let's talk, the deposits is probably a bigger deal than the assets. So let's talk this issue of deposits. We're talking about checking and savings accounts. So the question is, what is the duration of a checking and a savings account? And a lot of banks will actually say that their duration is not zero, it's some other amount, and it's a really theoretical thing. You can't actually calculate it. It looks like the duration should be zero because you can change the interest rate at any time. However, what banks think is these are not normal accounts. These are transaction accounts. They're just holding money kind of accounts. The banks don't have to be all that competitive. So interest rates rise, they don't necessarily have to raise these rates. When they fall, they don't necessarily reduce them, especially checking accounts. Checking accounts are, most people with their checking accounts, I would guess most of y'all don't even know what interest rate your checking account pays, if anything. If anything, right now, it's pretty close to zero. I think I get 9 cents a month from my checking account in interest. So, it's not, that's not what I'm retiring on. It's a small amount of money, but there was a time where my checking account gave me $2 or $3 of interest a month, like when interest was a little higher, but it's not something I thought about. First of all, people don't usually have, $50,000 in their checking account. So it's pretty insensitive. So what is the duration of that? And so our bank actually did 2 scenarios based on, one was based on the fact that deposits should have a 0 duration. That's just theoretical. But the other is, what is its true sensitivity? And the frustrating thing of that is we got radically different answers depending on which of those assumptions we make. Every bank has that problem. So it's a very theoretical thing. So the deposits, the checking accounts, the savings accounts, those liabilities, it's very theoretical, very difficult to really understand what's the true nature of these from an interest rate sensitivity standpoint. And most banks have some history they can look at, but we haven't had a history like this ever, where we've had rates really low for a long time, waiting for them to rise. We've seen rates falling, so banks have some sense of that, but rates staying low for a decade, and we're worried about them rising, banks don't really know. It's a very theoretical number. They can't go back to history. You're talking about going back to the 50s and 60s, where before credit cards and debit cards and all that kind of thing. So there is a theoretical aspect to it. And unfortunately, which is depressing a little bit, it's extremely material. And there's 2 assumptions you can make. Both are perfectly valid and reasonable, but you get radically different answers. Deposits are a huge part of a bank's liabilities. And they love it, right? I mean, you think about it, we as taxpayers are really subsidizing banks. You think about Frost Bank, if they had to go out and borrow money, they're probably going to borrow money at 4%. And yet they have CDs that are paying 1%. Who in the world would buy a CD from Frost Bank at 1%? Well, the federal government's stepping in and giving you protection from the FDIC. So Frost Bank, instead of borrowing 4% on the market, they can just issue CDs at 1%. So they're saving a lot of money. They love the deposits. It makes their funding really cheap. They're essentially being subsidized by the US federal government. It's a wonderful thing for them, but it does create an issue because it's such a big part. If they were doing debt, we know what the duration of debt is. That's very easy to calculate, but the duration of checking accounts, savings accounts, it's just really, really tough. So on the cash side, the cash that they have probably is a 0 duration. So that's probably not that difficult to calculate. It's really on the liability side. I think I said it wrong when I first started, but it's the liability side, it's the deposits. So I just completely ignored deposits. It's frustrating, but banks so love these deposits because they're such a cheap source of funding that they're definitely going to keep doing them. But it does create some interest rate uncertainty, maybe not risk, but it's just the uncertainty of knowing exactly how people will respond. So, I ask you, if you've got a checking account that's paying you 0.1% and rates rise and your bank doesn't change its rate, another bank's paying 0.5%, is that going to get you to move your checking account to another bank? And my guess is probably not, because it's really, there's a switching cost to checking accounts, right? Because you got outstanding checks and you got your debit card set up, you got all this stuff set up, so it's a pain. So it's hard to really say what the true nature of these liabilities is. All right. So we've got the duration of net worth is negative 4.91. And now we're going to do a swap. This is this is unlikely I'm going to do this on the exam, but you get this on the exam. So you get this and you get this. That's everything you get on the question. You get the introduction and then you're asked these questions. So essentially everything in black is on the exam, everything in yellow is the answer. I don't give you the answer. So the first thing you do when you set this up is you just type the word, you just type a right difference over here. And the difference there is a 100 basis points. The difference here is 150. And y'all can see y'all see why that's incredibly unusual, right? They should be flipped, shouldn't they? Anybody remember what we called that? Why should it be flipped? And the fixed should be a bigger difference than the floating. Anybody remember that term? Since I can't see any of you, I can't tell. Y'all remember this term? The term structure of credit spreads. Now, I told you it's a much more predictable term structure than is the yield curve. The yield curve is usually upward sloping, but not always. But credit spreads are always upward sloping. The more risky the bond, the much wider the spread is for the further out you go in time. So this question doesn't really make much sense. Why would AAA only be 100 basis points cheaper on 5 years, but 150 basis points cheaper on floating? It really doesn't make sense. But that's what it is. So where does AAA have the advantage? AAA has the advantage on floating, but the question is asking who has the comparative advantage on fixed. So BBB has the comparative advantage on fixed. Wherever the number is bigger, that's where AAA has the advantage. Wherever the number is smaller, that's where BBB has the advantage. Okay, so the number is smaller on fixed, so BBB has the comparative advantage on fixed, which is probably not going to be on the exam. It's probably going to look more like the first problem where BBB has the advantage on floating and AAA has a comparative advantage on fixed. All right. So just know this is out of line with normal situations. All right. So then we get into the swap. These two entities are going to swap. AAA is going to pay treasuries plus 15 to BBB, and BBB is going to pay LIBOR to AAA. And that's the way a swap works. I don't know what they're using today. So, you know, I'm so out of this market, but I'm going to stick with LIBOR. I need to update it and use the actual number now. I know they've come up with one, but I need to switch that. But I'm sticking with LIBOR. That's the way it works. It's not like BBB plays LIBOR plus 5 or LIBOR plus 10. I mean, it's a swap curve. So that's the way it's set up. So what's the ultimate borrowing cost? So let me so BBB is going to borrow where it has a competitive advantage, which is on fixed. So they're going to borrow a T plus 50. Where do we get that T plus 50? Well, it's given in that schedule. All right. Anybody tell me if you're not seeing where I'm getting the numbers from. So hopefully you have the class notes open and you can see the class notes. I'll show you again. Wait. So just remember this. T plus 50 and T plus 150, L plus 10, and L plus 160. All right, so if you remember that, you'll see where I'm getting the numbers. So BBB is going to borrow at T plus 150 because they have the comparative advantage in fixed. AAA is going to borrow floating at L plus 10 because they have the comparative advantage in floating. BBB is going to pay L, AAA is going to pay T plus 15 over to B. So AAA's ultimate cost is they're going to pay L plus 10. Why are they doing that? Because that's where they comparative advantage. And again, if AAA wanted floating rate debt, they can just stop there. there's no reason for them to do the swap. So if they like floating rate and floating rates we have the advantage, they're just going to borrow floating rate. There's no reason for them to do a swap. But here, we'll assume AAA really wants to have fixed rate debt. They want to lock it in, but they have a comparative advantage in floating. Triple B has a comparative advantage in fixed. So they're going to enter the swap and split the comparative advantage. They're going to pay, they're going to receive LIBOR from Triple B. So the L's are going to flip out. So they have no exposure to interest rate changes. So if LIBOR goes up, they're going to pay more on their debt, but they're going to receive more from Triple B, and it'll be a wash, and that all that interest rate volatility would just disappear. And they pay treasuries to Triple B, and they pay 15. You'll see how I set this up. I really encourage you to get in the habit of doing this. More important over here, but if they're paying, do a plus sign. If they're receiving, do a minus sign. So their net costs, the L's cancel out, so you got the T plus 25. If they borrowed fixed themselves, they would have paid T plus 50. So they're coming out ahead. You saw that the differences were 150 and 100. So you take the difference between those, that's 50. I'm just splitting that 50 between the two of them. And then Triple B is going to pay T plus 150. They're going to receive T from AAA. See how I did this? They receive T and they receive 15. All right, I'll be real clear on that. Don't do minus T plus 15 because you might have the sign going the wrong way. So they receive treasuries and they receive 15. So both of those are reducing their costs. I'm doing this from a cost standpoint. That's why what they pay is a plus sign, what they receive is a negative sign. And then they pay LIBOR, so the T's cancel out, so they're exposed now to floating rate, plus L, and then plus 135. They were paying, what was it? L plus 160. If they borrowed in floating rate, it would have been L plus 160, but they get it 25 basis points cheaper, so they'll be able to borrow at L plus 135. I do strongly recommend, I don't necessarily require it, but I do recommend you draw the schematic. You don't necessarily need the schematic up here, but you definitely want the schematic. You definitely want to have this clearly written out and be real careful. Now, if you end up with two T's or two L's, then you probably got the comparative advantage wrong. So if you have AAA, their cost being 2L minus T plus 25 or something, you got the comparative advantage incorrectly set up. And some of y'all, you see how you can check that. You know what the answer is going to be before you even start. The differences were 150 and 100. That's a 50 difference. So you can just say they're going to be 25, each are going to be 25 cheaper when this thing finishes. All right, so what did AAA do? So I want someone to answer here. Y'all are kind of staring at me. Zoom is kind of tough. It's a lot easier in the classroom, but be bold, be confident, your finance students. What did AAA do? Did they increase the duration of their liabilities, or they reduce the duration of liabilities?
They increase.
Increase the duration of liabilities, exactly right, because they went from floating, ended up in fixed. And Triple B reduced the duration of liabilities. They went from fixed and ended up floating. Fixed has a longer duration than floating. Floating essentially, LIBOR has a duration essentially of 0. And so they're going from, say, 5 years or whatever, maybe it's 4.8 years down to 0. Questions on that? It might be different than what you were shown for swaps in your other classes. I don't teach swaps from a textbook standpoint. I teach them from what I actually did in practice. So I had very little textbooks on swaps. I just know what it was like picking up the phone and calling the investment banker and saying, hey, I need to do a swap. So, there's probably some theoretical things here that we could add to it. I'm more of the pragmatist of how does it actually work in practice. All right, so that's what they end up with. So remember company X, their
Professor,
duration
I'm sorry.
network.
Can I interrupt you real quick? Do you have, or where is the power, or that in the PowerPoint? that you were showing us right now, is that in your
Uh,
content, like in the class notes and PowerPoints?
It's not yet because I built it, but I will save this to Blackboard after this class.
Okay, I think that'd be very beneficial. Thank you.
Sure. All right, so remember the company before had a negative duration net worth that was negative, like negative 4.8 years or something. So they want to immunize their balance sheet, which means they want to get their duration net worth from negative 4 something closer to 0. So they need to increase the duration net worth. To increase the duration net worth, you need to increase the duration of assets or reduce the duration of liabilities. And you just have to memorize that. If you want to increase the duration net worth, increase duration of assets, reduce duration of liabilities. If you want to reduce the duration of net worth, reduce duration of assets, increase duration of liabilities. Last class, we wanted to reduce duration of net worth, so we increase the duration of liabilities. So here we want a firm that is reducing the duration of their liabilities. And so which company is that going to be? Triple B, right? They started off fixed. They ended up floating. So they went from 5-year duration down to 0. So they reduced the duration of liabilities. So you'd want to be on triple B side because they need to decrease the duration of liabilities and increase the duration of net worth. So swap from fixed to floating to decrease the duration of liabilities. You notice these really, really important words here. I'm sorry, duration is what I meant to. Duration of. Make sure that's in your answer. Duration of. They're not trying to reduce liabilities. They're trying to reduce the duration liabilities and not increasing net worth. That'd be a nice thing to do, but that's not what they're doing here. They're increasing the duration of net worth. So always, if you're talking about duration, make sure duration is in your answer. All right, questions on this one. Some students get really confused here. What I would strongly recommend that you do, I think this is really key, especially on the exam, is right here where we finished on that negative 491. That's where you want to, before you move to the swap question, you want to say duration of net worth is too low, need to increase duration net worth by reducing duration of assets, or by increasing duration of assets or reducing duration of liability. I actually ask you that on exam. You'll see the practice questions. I actually ask you to ask that on this first part so that you're thinking about it before you get into the swap. Then when you get into the swap, it's not quite so confusing. Some students, if they answer the first question and get in a second question, then they're like, wow, wait, what did I do in the first question? They get themselves all turned around. So you want to be real clear going into the swap. Am I trying to go from fixed to floating or from floating to fixed? In this case, we want to go fixed to floating. We want to reduce the duration of liabilities to increase the duration of net worth. Questions up to there?
Do you think you could scroll back up a little bit to where you were talking about duration net worth too low?
Okay.
Yeah, right there. Thank
you. So the question is, do banks actually do this? And yeah, absolutely. Not only banks do this, but USAA, we did this every quarter for the bank, the insurance companies. It's very, very common. What was our exposure? And our CEO somewhat got really upset about it and actually was starting to make us do things that I thought were pretty dangerous because we did not have our pension plan in there. And so before he had us do some pretty radical things, I brought the pension plan in. When I brought the pension plan in, it changed everything. So our CEO went in using this analysis saying, wow, look how much money we lose if interest rates rise. And so he was trying to push us to have more exposure to interest rates falling so that we do well if rates fell. Well, pension plans do horribly if interest rates fall. So I brought the pension plan in and that changed everything. So it's really important. I mean, if you have 4 entities and you do this analysis on 3 and you start making adjustments, but the 4th one has this radical exposure like a pension plan, you may actually be making the company more risky. And that's exactly what he did. He greatly reduced the duration of the assets of one of our companies. And I had to show him, man, you're doing that. We're already exposed to rates. We lose money if rates fall, and you're making us exposed. You know, he was actually doubling up our risk. So, all right. So let's do dollar duration gap. Again, banks don't do this. This is more of a pension plan thing, but we'll do it just to get some practice here. So dollar duration gap analysis, you take the duration of assets times the dollar amount in assets minus the duration of liabilities times the dollar value of liabilities. If you don't know where I got these numbers, look back up at the problem and you can see it. That gives us a dollar duration gap of 735. We've got a 10-year duration interest rate swap. So we take 735 divided by 10. That gives us 73.5. We're going from fixed to floating. Now, does it work? So let's try it. It's a little tricky to get this work. So our duration of assets is 2.7 or 1100. Duration of liabilities, well, it's just changed. All right, so how do we handle that? Well, we had liabilities of 950 with a duration of 3.9. But now we just adjusted for another liability. We just did this interest rate swap, but we're going from fixed to floating. Right? You don't have to do this on the exam, but I really hope you understand this. If you're going from fixed to floating, you want to subtract the swap out. If you're going from floating to fixed, you add the swap in. So here we're going from fixed to floating, so we're going to subtract the swap. Its duration is 10 years. We take that and divide it by 950 minus 73.5. And that gives us a duration of liabilities of 4.12506 or something. I don't know how many decimal places it goes out. I stopped. It goes out a bunch more, but I'll go out 4 or 5 decimal places. It's more than that. All right. So what is our duration of net worth? And that is going to equal 2.7 duration of assets, right? Minus our liabilities. Our liabilities are what? 950 minus 73.5 divided by our assets, 1100 times the duration of liabilities, 4.12506 or whatever. I could stop there because when we're doing this formula, all we're trying to do is get everything in the parentheses to 0. So the leverage doesn't matter, but I'll put it in there anyway. So 1100 divided by 250. Y'all can try this. I'll do it. It may be off a little bit because of rounding. I'm going to do it real quick. Y'all try it and see what you get. Our goal obviously is to get it right at 0. So if you take 2.7 minus open parentheses 950 minus 73.5 divided by 1100. You take that times 4.12506. That's where the rounding is going to be an issue. I've got a parentheses problems all over the place, but I'll try it. You do that, you get something close to 0. You don't get exactly 0, but you should be pretty close to 0. If you don't round that 4.1506, you will get it. You will get it exactly to 0. I think. Let's see if I did. Oh, I left one thing out. What did I leave out? No, I did it. It's in there. There's something off. I don't know what's off here. You might see my error. 2.7, 950 minus 73. Oh, wait. No, that's correct. Oh, I'm sorry. That number is wrong. What did y'all get? Did I get a number there? I'm sorry, I got two problems on the board and I picked the wrong one. So ignore what I just did. It's actually 3.388. So if you do that, that should work. So 2.7 minus 950 over minus parentheses 950 minus 73.5 divided by 1100 times 3.388477, and you get pretty close to zero. I get 0.00000008. So that's just rounding because this goes out more decimal places. So sorry about that. I have two problems up there. I did this for the first problem and for the second problem. I just mixed them, all right? So the duration of assets is 2.7. So we take 2.7 minus, where our liabilities now, now the swap is not actually a liability in our books. We don't have 73.5 on our books, but our net worth and our liabilities are gonna move as if we did have that on our books. So you want to actually count it as if they had a liability of 73.5. But here they're going from fixed to floating. So it's actually a negative duration liability. So you actually subtract the 73.5 times the duration of the swaps. So our liabilities duration is 3.9. The swaps duration was 10. That was given in the problem. We divide that by our liabilities and it gives a duration of liabilities of 3.38. So reduce the duration of our liabilities just like we wanted to from 3.9 down to 3.388477. We plug all that in, duration of assets minus liabilities divided by assets times the duration of liabilities, and you can multiply all that up. I think this is actually 150. And when you do that, you'll get zero. So sorry for the confusion. I tell you what I'll do. Let me do it again with the first problem so y'all can see it twice. All right. So if I lost you on that, let's do it again. So here's where we did the previous problem. So let me give you the information, the duration of assets. This is from last week, our last class, equals 4.42 for an asset value of right at $1 billion. Duration of liabilities is going to equal 750 times 3.75. That's our duration of liabilities times our liabilities. Here, we're going from floating to fixed. So this 321, do we add it or subtract it? Let me see if anybody's with me. I might have lost all of y'all. The 321, we're going floating to fixed. So do we add the 321 or do we subtract it?
We add it.
Got it. All right. Thanks, Luke. Good. So we add 321.5 times its duration, which is 5 years. That's given in the problem. Divide that by 750 plus 321.5. That gives us a duration of liabilities. There's that 4.1250. It's 50583. I don't know how many decimal places that you go. So the duration of net worth is going to equal the duration of assets, 4.42, minus 750 plus 321.5 divided by 1,000. And all of that times 4.1250583. And if you want to multiply it by leverage, you can. You don't really need to. And I'm going to do it, see how close it gets, double check. I'm glad I did it on the last one because it would have been really confusing. So 4.42 minus 750 plus 321.5. Bill Gates is not helping me here, so I got to work around him. 321.5 divided by 1,000,000,000 times 4.1250583. When I do that, I don't get the number I wanted because I hit the wrong button. Yeah, I get 0.00000003. So it's essentially 0. If I use the unrounded numbers, it should come out exactly to 0. So when I click on the unrounded number, I get exactly 0. So if they go out and enter a floating to fixed swap at 321 million notional amount with a duration of 5 years, if they do that, their balance sheet should be completely immunized to interest rate changes. They shouldn't care if rates rise or fall. They should be completely protected. Their duration of net worth is right at 0. All right, take a picture of that if you can't write it all down. You don't have to do this on the exam, but you certainly can if you want to show off. I always like students to like to show off, and so that you know that it's a good practice to have. So there's that one. And then there's this one. All right. I think I'm going to get into the duration of, into the concept of notional value a little bit more when we talk about pension plans, because it makes a little bit more sense. All right, we've done 2 problems. I think I got a couple more out there. Before the exam, I'll give you another one, maybe from last semester or last year, that you can work as a practice problem. I'm not sure, some students like, give me 20 problems, and I'm not sure every problem is exactly the same. So I'm not sure 20 problems is going to help you much more than 2. You either understand it or you don't. But it's a good skill to have to understand this. If you understand this and really can explain it, you'll be quite impressive if you interview with the bank. Even if you interview with a life insurance company, life insurance is far more complicated than this, but just understanding this idea of immunizing a balance sheet, setting up the duration of your assets and liabilities in such a way that you're immune. What's the big difference in life insurance? We'll talk about that, but the big difference in life insurance is convexity. Life insurance companies are very worried about convexity, where banks really aren't that concerned with it. It's not that big of a deal for banks. So again, is this interest rate arbitrage? And it's really not interest rate swap arbitrage, because while it's true both entities saw the cost of debt drop 25 basis points, that seems like a free lunch. All they did was swap with each other, and both of them got a big discount on their debt. They're picking up the counterparty risk. So this swap dealer, if this swap dealer goes insolvent when you are getting paid money, then you're out of luck, except for the collateral. You have collateral, but that collateral might be 102% of the market value of the swap. But if interest rates move dramatically, you can be out $50, $100 million pretty quickly. So that's called counterparty risk. Counterparty risk is a form of credit risk. It's a type of credit risk. And if we were doing a credit risk on your banks, you would almost all be seeing the master netting arrangement, which says banks have the right to net all of their swaps to a particular entity, so that they reduce their risk, that counterparty risk, as much as they can. Let me tell you the story 2008, because 2008 is I know y'all may not even been alive in 2008. I guess y'all were alive in 2008, right? I used to say, remember when Jimmy Carter was president, but I don't say that anymore. So at least I know y'all aren't that old. So let me tell you 2008. So in 2008, I'd set up swaps with JP Morgan that I wasn't worried about at all. JP Morgan went insolvent, the world was coming to an end. That was going to be the end of it. But the other one was with Morgan Stanley. Now, if you go back to 2008, boy, it's hard. I almost have nightmares. I don't want to tell you all this because I'm going to have a nightmare tonight, but I'll tell you anyway, because boy, those were rough years. But we're going into the weekend and Lehman Brothers is in a lot of trouble, tremendous amount of trouble. They may not make it. And so the Federal Reserve gets all these people together and they say, we got to get someone to bail Lehman Brothers out. And people say, no, we're not going to do it. No one wants to do it. And so then the Fed says, okay, well, if Lehman goes under, Merrill Lynch is going under. If Merrill Lynch goes under, Morgan Stanley's going under. If Morgan Stanley goes under, Goldman Sachs. So the opinion at that time is if Merrill goes insolvent, all four of those banks are going under: Lehman, Merrill, Morgan, and Goldman. And that was probably true. And they were working as hard as they could. They said, if you're not going to buy Lehman, can I at least get someone to buy Merrill Lynch? And it didn't look like it was going to work. And so the disaster the next week was just going to be, I know y'all think 2008 was bad, but if Merrill Lynch had not survived that weekend, 2008 would have been horrible, far worse than we can imagine. For some reason, and you shall look this up and read some of this history, it's pretty amazing. For some reason, Bank of America stepped in and bought Merrill at a huge premium. No one knows why they paid so much for it. But Bank of America came in and bought Merrill. They probably could have bought them for $10 if they waited till Monday, but they paid $30 a share for them. Just a ridiculously high price. The thought is, I'm just telling you what you read in books, so I don't know what the true story is because I don't know the background. But the thought is Bank of America is this kind of regional bank, North Carolina, doesn't get much respect from the New York money center banks. It's kind of this bunch of country hicks over in North Carolina kind of thing. They didn't get a lot of respect. And so their CEO thought, wow, I could buy Merrill Lynch, one of the most highly respected, sophisticated firms out there. So there was some thought that this was more ego driven than it made sense. I mean, think about it. If you're the CEO of Bank of America, do you want to buy a firm like Merrill Lynch where you have no clue what their assets are worth? You don't know if the risk is 5 billion or 80 billion. You have no clue. Would you touch that transaction? It really made no sense. And no one really knew what was inside these banks. They just knew it was a disaster, but they really and there was no time on that weekend. There was no way Bank of America could have gone in and done a detailed analysis of what Merrill Lynch had. This was pretty much blind faith. So they bought Merrill Lynch out. If they had not done that, boy, it would have just been a disaster. Now, remember, I've got a swap with Morgan Stanley. Now, I'm not in my department anymore, but I went back to my department and I told them, if I were you guys, I would get out of that swap because it was up maybe $100 million. So get out of that swap. You got the collateral, exit the swap. And they said, well, we can't do that because we're hedging. I said, well, a couple things are going to happen. You're worried about rates falling. You make a lot of money if rates fall. But if Morgan Stanley goes under on Monday, rates going to fall a bunch. And that swap's going to go from $100 million to $400 million. But you're not going to get any of that. You're only going to get your collateral, $100 million, because they're going to be bankrupt. So the fact that your swap's going to go from 100 to 400, you're not going to get the money anyway. Y'all see what I'm saying there, right? Morgan Stanley, they're insolvent. You're not going to get any money. They're going to be shut down. So even though you're hedging, you're still going to lose. You're not going to get your $300 million. However, if Morgan Stanley survives, interest rates will rise on Monday, and you'd be glad you weren't in the swap because now you saved like $50 million on the swap, and you can enter the swap again on Monday and have made 50 million bucks. And so guess what the department did? They did nothing. So they didn't listen to me. They didn't work for me anymore. I didn't have any persuasion over them. They did nothing. If they'd done what I suggested, they would have been $50 million better off. I was trying to actually protect them, but they didn't believe. I don't remember what their argument was. Maybe they're not here to defend themselves. Maybe they had a good argument. The thing they kept telling me is we're hedging. And I'm going to show you why that argument, we're hedging, is not a good argument. There are times when you're hedging and you do something very tactical. And that's what I was recommending them to do. So yeah, you know, these swaps, the counterparty risk is huge. Now, when we negotiated our swap contract, it was pretty hilarious to me because Morgan Stanley, they said, you know, we don't know USAA that well. So we'd really like to get some extra collateral from them. And I'm thinking, you know what, you got a very highly rated entity with a pension plan that's overfunded. Your risk here is incredibly small, but I'm very worried about you. So, hey, if you want extra collateral, then you give me extra collateral. I was like, yeah, I'm fine with that. They can demand extra collateral from me as long as they give me extra collateral. So I actually demanded, like, I kind of let them jump into their own requests and say, hey, if you want an extra 3% collateral, then you give me an extra 3% collateral. Because I was worried about Morgan Stanley. I wasn't really worried. It's not that JP Morgan couldn't have gone under. It's just, I mean, I don't think we'd be sitting here if JP Morgan had gone under. It would have been, you know, we'd be North Korea would have taken us over and we'd all be North Korea now. I mean, it would have been an absolute bloodbath. It's hard to imagine how bad that would have been. So I felt comfortable with JP Morgan. In fact, one thing I thought with my old department is, hey, you know what? If you don't want to get out of the swap, then sell your swap with Morgan and put it over in JP Morgan, because at least you're safer with JP Morgan. They're unlikely to go under. And so then if Morgan Stanley does go under and rates do fall, then you have your exposure with JP Morgan, but they didn't do that either. So it's frustrating to me. I think in these times, like a 2008, and I think you're going to see a 2008. I don't know, you maybe not, maybe you'll never see a 2008 in your life, but if you see a 2008, y'all remember what I showed y'all at the beginning of this class? I showed you that that movie, The Duel. How do you do risk management when survival is all you care about? When you get into 2008, your thinking about risk changes radically. You start doing things you don't do in normal times. And that's what I was trying to get my old department to think about doing. But they said, forget you, you don't work here anymore. We don't have to listen to you. And they didn't. And they didn't have to listen to me, and they didn't listen to me. All right. So that brings up this concept of potential exposure. So remember with the interest rate swaps, sometimes you owe money and sometimes they owe you money. So it's not like normal debt. If you loan someone $100 million, your exposure is $100 million. Well, with a swap, you may owe them money right now, but you still have exposure because interest rates could change really quickly and now they owe you. And so what we do is something called potential exposure. And essentially it's a value at risk analysis. What you do is you run scenarios and you try to say, in a worst case scenario, what's the most they would owe me? So that's what potential exposure means. You might actually, on your bank, you might try on your bank, searching on the term potential exposure, see if you can find it. And also try finding the word master netting. Try those two terms and see if you can find them in your bank's annual report, just to give you a little more exposure to what we're talking about here. So potential exposure is not what someone actually owes you, but what someone could owe you in a particular kind of worst case scenario. And so that's what we read. We ran many scenarios, and we decided, hey, in this worst case scenario, this is how much JP Morgan could owe us. And we do that over the collateral, what collateral we currently have. In this scenario, this is what Morgan could owe us. So potential exposure is a risk measure, and it's essentially a value at risk type of risk measure. I doubt many of y'all have heard the term potential exposure. Maybe if you had swaps in other class, they talked about it. All right, questions on that? So y'all see how banks do this? They're pretty effective at doing this. Now, if I were interviewing with a USAA or Frost Bank or Broadway Bank, I don't know what Frost does. I don't know how sophisticated they are, but you may discover some of these banks don't have any derivatives at all. No swaps, no futures. That is really unusual, and you could really challenge them on, why don't you use derivatives to manage your interest rate risk? It's a good question. It's a valid question. It'd be interesting to see what. Now, how would you figure out if Frost uses swaps and futures? Well, you just go to annual report. They'll have a schedule on all of the derivatives, and so you could go look it up. So it's there, and they probably tell you that they're doing it to manage interest rate risk. So that you can figure out. You can't figure that out for USAA because they're not publicly traded. So you kind of I'm just telling you that when I left, they weren't using any derivatives on the banking side. Right. Again, any questions here? Hopefully this is sinking in. It's not too tough on the exam because the exam is exactly what we've just done twice here. I'm more interested in the comprehension, the really understanding. So you're going to write about this for your bank, interest rate risk. You're going to probably find a lot of what we just talked about in your bank. So hopefully this gives you a way to really understand it better. So before we jump on to the next topic, let me talk through paper one a little bit because I really want you to make really good progress on paper one this weekend. All right, so this is a document, and I'll put it out there on Blackboard, but I want to edit it a little bit. But the first thing you can do is an introductory section. What committees do they have? Who are the players? Do they have a risk officer? What does the board of directors do? That kind of thing. Just an introductory. One thing I didn't put in here is include their statements of philosophy. I'm really into, you start that risk management section. Do they say risk management is the most important thing we do? One of the most important things you do. One thing I think is interesting, I'll put this on the side. Is there anything in the bank's mission statement on risk? So if I do Bank of America mission statement, is there anything in their mission statement that talks about risk? So, sorry. Bank of America's mission statement is to help make financial lives better by connecting those we serve with the resources they need to be successful. The company is committed to delivering this by focusing on responsible growth together with social, environmental, and governance leadership. Nothing about risk in there. Let's look at Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs' mission is to advance sustainable economic growth and financial opportunity across the globe. Our purpose and our values. So I'm just going to do a search on the word risk. Doesn't come up at all. I remember last year I did this. I think there was one bank that, it might have been Citibank. I can't remember. There's one bank that had an explicit comment on risk, but most of the others did not mention risk in its mission statement. Maybe none of them do now. Now they're all focused on social, environmental, governance. We provide responsibly provide financial service to enable growth and progress. Again, let's search on the word risk. Environmental financial goal, measuring and managing the climate risk and impact on our customers. Only one thing in there. And here they're talking about climate risk. All right, so it's kind of interesting to me, but do look for it. Is there anything in the overall, what they say, this is what we're all about, is there anything about risk? There should be. Risk should be one of the number one things JP Morgan is talking about, because we as taxpayers are bailing them out if they go under. They better be focused on risk, but a lot of banks don't put that in risk. USAA's mission statement doesn't discuss risk. It may talk about helping the customer manage their risk, but managing the risk of the company is not in theirs. So, you know, look and see if you can see something like that. That could be really an interesting side note. One thing you could do, just go to your annual report of your bank, type the word risk on a search, and see what's the first page the word risk comes up and what's the context. That might be something to add to your paper. That might be interesting. All right, you're not doing section 2, so you're good on that. So your section 2 is market price interest rate risk. So you're going to do define, measure, mitigate. And then section 3 is your conclusion, your assessment of your overall bank. How good are they at risk management? And then do you think this bank is, oh, wow, I got a typo in there, is too big and too complex to manage? I'm not sure what this means, so I'm just going to strike it out. That was probably a part of a discussion. Oh, well, one thing I did on the board, this is more of the introduction section. What is the board's actual knowledge of these issues? You're going to discover this is really complicated stuff. If the board of directors for JP Morgan is the CEO from Caterpillar or the CEO from Disney, what does Disney or Caterpillar know about interest rate risk and price risk and value at risk, those kind of things? I remember the board at UTSA, really smart people. I mean, there's a bunch of generals and admirals, obviously really smart people. A lot of them had really strong mathematics. A lot of them were engineers. And I remember we had a new board member at UTSA, and he wanted to meet with all the different departments. So he came to our department. I looked at his resume. He had a math degree. I don't know if it was a master's or PhD, but I was like, wow, this guy's really impressive. He's going to love talking to us. We're going to get into some really technical stuff. He came in, we mentioned bonds, and he's like, no, I don't know any of this investment stuff. He was like, I don't know any of this. He's on the board of a financial services company. So yeah, I don't know any of that stuff. I don't know anything about banking or insurance or investing. It's like, okay, why are you on the board? Now he could have learned it, as smart as he was, he could have learned it, but that wasn't his background. He was a general. Yeah, Corey, I'm going to add this document after this class. I'm editing as we go. So this will be out there under documents for the papers. Right, so that's what you can look. Who are the board members of your board? Are they bankers, or do they have banking backgrounds? I think that's pretty important. We're asking the board to manage the risk of this bank on something they probably have no background on at all. Are we asking too much of board of directors? Are we expecting too much of them to really be able to manage risk? Now, one thing with UTSA, when Bob Davis went to the board, he was full disclosure. He showed them everything that was going on, no matter how complicated it was. And if they didn't understand it, they had to sit there and ask questions until they did. So he was an educator. He was always teaching them, training them. He didn't want them to have any excuses as I don't really understand this stuff. But even then, it was a tall order because, boards meet, 4 times a year? And they're given a packet, a foot thick. And you're talking about a JP Morgan or Citibank, these global entities with trillions of dollars in assets. And somehow this board's going to step in and say, hey, yeah, I think you're managing your risk pretty well. The other thing you're going to see is auditing. What are auditors? They're accountants. What accountants know about this stuff? They're smart people, but what do they know about this stuff? There's probably the auditors working for JP Morgan know it because they've been working for JP Morgan for years, so they've learned it, but still. And then the committees, what are their incentives? What are their conflicts of interest? What's going on with the committee? So I might leave this in here, but you'll have to know why I put it in there. And then the next thing you might ask, and this one's, I think, pretty interesting because most of your banks have something going on. Let me real quickly just, let's see, JP Morgan. So JP Morgan, you have the London well. What was that? What happened there? Why did they lose so much money in doing that? Goldman. I can never remember the letters here. 2M. Can't remember the name of the company. Yeah, boy, I can't remember the name of it. I haven't seen it in a while, but I can probably find it in here. But it starts. It's either Malaysia or, boy, it's been so many years. I mean, you can just say major. Why major losses? There it is. 1 MDB. I can see why I can't remember it. 1 MBD, so it's Malaysia. It's a sovereign wealth fund. Why did they have that loss? So when you're looking at your bank, all of your banks have some major risk, some huge loss that they've suffered. Would what they're doing today have prevented that, or can it happen again? So you might actually just type in major losses. I just typed Goldman Sachs large loss, and a Wikipedia page came up, Goldman Sachs controversies. And it listed all kinds of things that Goldman Sachs has done. So, you've got the internet there. So would this process that they have prevent a major risk from occurring, or is it all smoke and mirrors? Is it a process just to make it look good, or there's really nothing going on at all? Sometimes I feel that with a lot of entities. UTSA has us watching all these videos on certain risks. Are they having professors watch these videos on risk to reduce risk? Are they having us watch these videos on risk so that if we do something wrong, they can say, hey, we gave them these videos, they watched them, it's not our fault, we trained them. What is the goal here? So is the goal appearances, or is the goal actually to reduce risk? One thing I loved about Bob Davis as our CEO is his goal was to reduce risk. He did not want to go through the motions. He didn't want smoke and mirrors. So he asked tough questions. Those meetings were intense. He went through it in detail. And I love that. To me, that's what you want a CEO to be doing. That's their job. That's what they should be doing. You look at AIG, they had a CEO like that in Greenberg, and then he left the company, and the new management came in, and they just kind of went through the motions. They didn't really do risk management. They said, we have this great risk management process, so we don't have anything to worry about. Greenberg wouldn't have accepted that. Greenberg was a lot like Bob Davis. It's just like, I want to know the details. I don't want this blown up under my watch. So think about that with your committees. Obviously, you got some famous people here. What is Jamie Dimon's background? My guess is he understands this stuff extremely well. Everything we just talked about, he could probably at the top of his head go 80 levels deeper. I don't know what his actual degree, college degree is. He has a master's or not. I'm looking at Wikipedia real quick. Early life and education. He majored in psychology and economics at Tufts. After graduating, he worked in management consulting. During summer at Harvard, he worked at Goldman Sachs. He graduated, had an MBA from Harvard. That's pretty impressive, right? After graduation from Harvard, he turned out offers at Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and Lehman Brothers to join American Express. He's got an MBA from Harvard, and he's got a lot of financial background. everything on Wikipedia. There, Sandy Wells' name comes up constantly in part of his background. So Sandy Wells was the head of Citibank. So obviously he has that connection, that background. How technically proficient he is, I don't know. Harvard MBA is not all that particularly technical. Harvard MBA is a lot of case studies versus like really, really intense mathematics like you might see at an MIT or New York Stern, but it's still impressive. So I mean, that's the kind of things you do. You know, Goldman Sachs has their new CEO. What is his background? What does he know? I can real quickly. I get my, you know, ever since I retired, I get my CEOs mixed up. So Solomon, how could you forget Solomon? He's got a famous name. So his background doesn't really tell us. He was at Bear Stearns, Drexel Berman. He's got some pretty horrible names in his in his background. So he's definitely been in the, maybe that's good or maybe that's bad. The fact that he's at entities that blew up, maybe that's good from his standpoint that he had some of that background, not that they blew up while he was there. So it doesn't show his education at all. So I don't know. It says Hamilton College BA, and that's all it says. But his last name's Solomon. I don't know if he's related to the Solomons, you know, the big treasury investors. All right. So common approaches to risk management. Things you should see on the measurement side are things like stress test, earnings drawdowns, earnings at risk, terms like that. Every one of you will have stress tests. Value at risk. Every single one of your banks are going to have value at risk. Look and see what their risk tolerance is. And some of the charts that they provide, you want to, I mean, I showed some of them to you earlier. I mean, they're really impressive charts. A lot of them do VAR backtesting now, which is essentially just a chart that just shows how things came out versus what they expected. I doubt you're going to find this, the duration of assets, liabilities, and net worth. You might do a search on the word duration and see. Most banks actually don't talk about this, even though I know they're doing it, they just don't talk about it. So one thing you'll see, instead of them talking about it, they'll say that we have well-calibrated, advanced, sophisticated, state-of-the-art, whatever, you know, all those terms they use, models, which they probably do. On the interest rate risk, they probably do have very sophisticated models. But rather than telling you what they actually do, they'll just throw out a bunch of these words to make it sound like they're doing something really spectacular. They're all probably doing practically the exact same thing. All right. Credit risk we're not doing, so we can leave that out. But I do want you to look at credit risk. Measuring credit risk, most entities have some type of internal rating system. They like rate debt that companies are going to loan to. Most do a stress test of some type on the credit risk, just like they do on price risk. Underwriting is a big part of credit risk, where they, you know, do a financial analysis of the company. Aging schedules, credit watch lists are really important. We did that. We did credit watch lists at UTSA. I'll talk about that more when we get the credit. And then monitoring credit spreads, like credit default swap spreads, to see if the market itself can tell you. They might look at credit default swap spreads. They might look at option prices. They're trying to find something that's telling them that, hey, the market's telling us something unusual is going on with this entity, and we just loaned them $100 million. What's going on? But we're not going to do credit risk. So you don't have to worry about that one. And I really am saving you a lot of work by not doing credit risk. It really is the most difficult one. The one that you see for both are economic earnings, economic net worth. Anytime you see the word economic, what they're saying is forget GAAP accounting. Let's mark everything the market. Let's look at things on a true economic basis. And then all of them talk about ongoing monitoring and reporting and those kind of things. On mitigation, on price risk, the banks you're looking at are all going to use futures, forward swaps, and swaptions. Just do a search on those words, and that will help you find it. If you can tell, most of them will have a schedule and tell you which derivatives they're using. So it'll be interesting, you know, just to look and see which ones they're using and what the sizes are they are. They'll use terms like generic, like hedges, internal hedges. Usually that means, if they say hedges, that usually means they're using derivatives of some type. So sometimes they're kind of in the script, they're not real detailed. On credit risk, you're not doing that, but credit default swaps is a big one. We talk about the master netting arrangements. Collateral is obviously extremely important for credit risk. Loan to value. Now, loan to value could be a measurement or a mitigation. I think a loan to value is being a mitigation because if the property is worth $1 million and you can only loan out 70% of that, you can only loan out $700,000. That's going to mitigate your risk. That gives you a 30% drop in the value of the collateral before you start having losses. And then loan restructuring is a big one. You have someone that can't pay you, so you sit down with them and you set up some schedule so they can pay you. But we're not doing credit risk. And then one that apply both the risk to credit and the price risk limits. All of you are going to have risk limits. In fact, you do a search on the word limits itself, and you'll find that. It's just everybody does it. They may call it something slightly different, but if they have limits, where are the limits? Is it on the security level, an issuer level, an industry level, a country level, security type? Where is that limit imposed? How do they determine the size of the limits? They're probably not going to tell you that. Do they have board limits related to your stress tests? Just like I was showing you, you're probably not going to find that. Loan securitization is a big part of what banks do. Loan securitization really impacts interest rate risk so that banks don't have these 30-year mortgages on their books. They securitize them, get them off their books. That greatly reduces their interest rate risk. You might do a search on the word securitization and see if they discuss it under the risk mitigation technique. And if they do, is it under price risk? It should be under price risk, but it could be under credit risk or both. But just do a search on the word securitization. All right, so I will put this document out there. It's not like everything in it, but it does give you some ideas. Now, I do have some students that are like worried about this first paper. So use the paper description, use this document. And then if you're really worried, come to me in advance, maybe a week before the paper is due. Set up time with me and I'll go through it with you to make sure you're not missing something major. All right. Questions on any of that? Where we're going to go next class, I think it's actually the coolest part is we're going to get into pension plans. There's a blog I want you to read, and I'll send you the link to that blog for this weekend. It's a big question on the first exam, so you definitely want to have that. And so we're gonna get into it. Here's the link to the blog I want you to do. So next class, we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about pension plan balance sheet immunization. We're not going to spend quite as much time on life insurance and endowments, but we'll talk them at a high level. All right, that's it. I'll let you out a few seconds early here.